When we talk about revolutions, the French Revolution is, well, it's the big one. It wasn't just a single event. It was this decade-long storm of ideas, of hope, of incredible violence and change that didn't just reshape France. It basically redrew the map for the entire modern world. So how on earth did a kingdom that seemed so powerful manage to just collapse and turn everything completely upside down? Let's get into it.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll see why France was on the absolute brink of explosion. Then, we'll watch as the first sparks of rebellion catch fire. After that, we dive into the most radical and, frankly, terrifying phase of the whole thing. We'll also meet some of the key people who defined the era, and finally, we'll see how a new dawn broke under the shadow of an emperor.
So, our story really starts in a nation that was a total powder keg, just waiting for a spark. Let's take a look at the conditions that were setting the stage for this kind of massive, society-shattering explosion.
And really, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau just nailed the core problem with this quote. This wasn't just some abstract political issue. It was deeply, fundamentally unfair. You had a tiny handful of people literally gorging themselves on luxuries, while the vast majority of the population was starving.
This incredible inequality was baked right into the system, into what they called the Ancien Régime. French society was split into three groups, or estates. You had the clergy and the nobility. Together, they made up maybe 2% of the population. They held all the wealth, all the power, and paid practically zero taxes. And then you had the third estate. That was everyone else, 98% of the people, carrying the entire financial weight of the kingdom on their backs.
So on top of this insane social structure, the kingdom was flat broke. Decades of very expensive wars, especially helping out the American Revolution, ironically, had created crippling debt. To make matters worse, bad harvests led to famine, and the price of bread, the main food for the poor, went through the roof. For the average person, this wasn't some economic debate. It was a life-or-death struggle every single day.
And into this powder keg, you start throwing some very dangerous ideas. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau began questioning everything: the power of the church, the divine right of kings. And at the exact same time, you have French soldiers coming home from America, telling stories about how they helped create a new country based on liberty and human rights. The fuse was now well and truly lit. So, how did this simmering crisis finally boil over? Okay, let's get to the point of no return. This is where a series of rapid-fire events just completely changed the game for France, forever.
The summer of 1789 moved at a dizzying speed. The king, desperate for money, called a meeting of the Estates General. But the Third Estate, totally fed up with being ignored, did something unthinkable. They walked out and declared themselves the real government of France, the National Assembly. The king locked them out, so they just found a nearby tennis court and swore an oath right then and there. They would not leave until they had written a new constitution.
And then came the moment that lit up the sky. On July 14th, the people of Paris, hearing rumors that the king was going to crush them, stormed the Bastille fortress. Look, it barely had any prisoners, I think it was just 7 guys, but that was never the point. The Bastille was this huge, terrifying symbol of the king's power to do whatever he wanted, so when the people tore it down, brick by brick, it was a massive statement. It showed that the old rules were over. This was the moment a protest truly became a revolution.
With the power of the people behind them, the National Assembly issued this incredible document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. I mean, it was groundbreaking stuff, declaring all men are born free and equal. But, and this is a big but, that new equality wasn't for everyone. They created this category of active citizens, basically men who owned enough property to pay taxes. They were the only ones who got to vote. So women, the poor, they were still left out. Those early, heady ideals of liberty and equality, well, they were about to get swallowed up by paranoia, fear, and state-sponsored violence. We're now entering the phase where the revolution, as the famous saying goes, began to devour its own children.
This was the reign of terror. France was at war with most of Europe and facing civil war at home. So a small, powerful group called the Committee of Public Safety took control, led by the infamous Maximilien Robespierre. Their goal was terrifyingly simple: use terror to create a perfect republic of virtue. And that meant hunting down and eliminating anyone they considered an enemy of the revolution, whether they were real enemies or not. And the scale of this violence was just mind-boggling. To give you just one example, in the city of Nantes, over 4,000 people were executed by being tied up and drowned in the river. And that was in just a few months, in just one city. This kind of thing was happening all over France.
And of course, the enduring symbol of it all was the guillotine.
The incredible irony is that it was originally invented as a more humane and enlightened way to execute people. But it quickly became this relentless machine of death, and executions became a form of public entertainment. Huge crowds would gather to watch, a truly grim spectacle at the heart of the new republic.
You know, a revolution isn't just a list of dates and events. It's about people. So who were these people? Who were the faces in the crowd, the leaders who rose from the chaos? Let's meet some of the key groups and individuals who really defined this period.
The real muscle behind the most radical phase of the revolution was a group called the sans-culottes. These were the working-class people of Paris. Their name literally means without the fancy silk breeches that the rich guys wore. It was a badge of honor. These weren't just an angry mob, they were a political force. They were the ones demanding cheap bread, storming the palaces, and always pushing the politicians to take more extreme measures.
So when you have all this talk about universal rights, it's no surprise that women like Olympe de Gouges spoke up. She saw that the rights of man left women out entirely, so she wrote her own version. And her argument, captured in this quote, is just so powerful. She's basically saying, hey, if the state has the right to execute me, then I should have the right to speak in public. She was a true pioneer, but her radical ideas were seen as a threat, and she too was sent to the guillotine.
The shockwaves of the revolution didn't stop at the French border, either. They traveled all the way to the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue. There, a formerly enslaved man, Toussaint Louverture, heard these ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, and he took them seriously. He became this brilliant general and led the most successful slave revolt in all of human history, eventually creating the independent nation of Haiti and abolishing slavery there for good. An absolutely incredible story.
Okay, so after a full decade of chaos, of war, of terror, France was exhausted. People were desperate for stability, for an end to the bloodshed. The revolution had created this massive power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a man who was, in many ways, the ultimate product of the revolution itself. A young, incredibly ambitious general.
His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He'd become a national hero, fighting for the Republic. But the government that came after the terror was corrupt and weak, and people started looking to Napoleon as the only person strong enough to bring back order. And in 1799, he did exactly that. He seized power in a military coup, and just like that, the French Revolution was over.
So, after all that, what was it all for? Well, its legacy is just immense. The revolution completely obliterated the old feudal system of kings and nobles in France. It created a society where, for the first time, all citizens were equal before the law, and its ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, spread like wildfire, inspiring countless other movements for freedom all around the world for the next century and beyond. Which brings us to the big, complicated question at the heart of it all. The revolution gave us the language of modern democracy and human rights, but it also gave us state-sponsored terror and led directly to a military dictator. So, how do we even begin to measure its success? How do you weigh those incredible world-changing ideals against the horrifying price that was paid to achieve them? It's something that's still debated to this day.